Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Changing Tomorrow with Logic Models. My name is Celit Bañuelos, and will be moderating today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items. BBP is the only binational group along and across the 2,000-mile border that unites. I'm sorry. I'll have to do it again. Okay, stop recording. Stop recording. Oh, now I can't stop recording. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Changing Tomorrow with Logic Models. My name is Celit Bañuelos, and will moderate today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to share a couple of items about the BBP. The BBP is the only binational group along and across the 2,000-mile border that unites a vibrant network of national, regional, and local leaders and organizations who are making a difference on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border. Our mission is to support a network of organizations that build prosperity through leadership, collaboration, and philanthropy in the U.S.-Mexico border region. It's not advancing?
Not advancing.
That's what happened to me the last time.
Yeah. Rain. So, oh wait, now it advanced.
Oh, there we go.
All right. Well, let me just. Okay. Boom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Changing Tomorrow with Logic Models. My name is Celit Bañuelos, and will moderate today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to share information about the BBP. BBP is the only binational group along and across the 2,000-mile border that unites a vibrant network of national, regional, and local leaders and organizations who are making a difference on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border. Our mission is to support a network of organizations that build prosperity through leadership, collaboration, and philanthropy in the U.S.-Mexico border region. I'd like to present and welcome George Nunes, today's panelist, who is president of Captación Fundraising Consulting. Thank you so much, George, for participating with the BBP once again.
Hi, Celit. This is George.
Hi.
Hi. It's nice to be here again, and I am happy to be with you and all the BPP members who have joined us.
Thank you. We're very excited.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, let's get started, okay?
Wonderful.
All right. So our subject today is Changing Tomorrow with Logic Models. And as you can see from these dominoes here, what logic models really do is allow us to have a conversation with ourselves that say if and then. And the reason why I think it's important to embrace using logic models is that we have so much competition for funding for the projects that are important to us. And getting this funding is critical for our BPP members and for a thriving border region. So anything that we can do to make our appeals, our proposals that we submit, more effective and have even the slightest edge over our competitors, then it is worth pursuing. And so a logic model is one of those things that can help us get noticed, be respected, and be funded by grant makers. So it's a planning process. Now here's what we're going to talk about today. And so we're pretty much looking at 5 sections. We'll first start with an overview. And in section 1, then we will move into section 2, which is really the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And that will give us the background to them. And then we will move into creating our basic understanding of logic models. And then I am going to walk us through creating an actual logic model using some samples. And then finally, how our members can use the logic model for greater success. Now, the logic model that I'm going to be talking about today, and I think it's worth perhaps mentioning that in Spanish, the term is really translated exactly. It's a modelo lógico, and the concepts are not limited to one language or the other. They are really applicable to using in a variety of settings, a variety of countries. And one reason why you and I have selected to use the Kellogg Foundation Logic Model Guide is because, first of all, it's free. The Kellogg Foundation wonderfully operates and funds projects in both Mexico and the United States. And the Logic Model Guide is available for downloading online at the Foundation website in both English and Spanish. And I'll talk more about that later, about how people can get to that. So let's dive right into section 1, the overview. Now, whenever I talk to my colleagues about the model, they do one of 3 things. They groan, they panic, and some even look like they're going to fall asleep. When we talk about, hey, did you notice that this foundation is going to need a logic model next year? And I just want to tell everybody, it's okay. If that's how you react, just admit it. We can get past that and find a way to eliminate the groans, the panic, and the sleepiness. So logic models really get a bad rap. And simply all that they are is a planning tool that allows an organization to say, if we do this particular thing, then this good thing will happen. Logic models help create success in fundraising. And when we're successful fundraisers, it means that the people, places, and things that we care deeply about will get the services and the support that they need. All right, let's move on to our learning objectives. So we have 4 learning objectives today. And the first is that we are going to learn how to complete a sample planning template. We're going to learn how to understand the basic components of a logic model. Next, we will learn how to explain the advantages of using one in program planning and grant writing. And finally, we're going to gain resources for obtaining further information. We have some specific vocabulary that we'll be using today, so I just want to call everyone's attention to it, and we will define them in terms of logic models as we move along. So, input, output, activity, resource, outcome, impact, and evaluation. We'll get back to these terms. Sorry, I'm going to move forward, not backwards. All right, section 2. Let's move into the who, what, when, where, why, and how of logic models. First of all, let's talk about who can benefit from using a logic model. So basically 3 groups we'll talk about today. Your staff and volunteers when they are planning their programs. Your board of directors when it is evaluating each organization's effectiveness. And then finally, our funders, who are our big audience when we're using logic models. Funders like corporations, foundations, and government entities deciding where to invest their money. Now, what is a logic model? So we can describe it in two different ways. One is that it is just a picture of how your organization does its work. What are the theories and assumptions that underlie what you do? And the second one is to look at a logic model as a map. It's a map that links your program outcomes to the strategies, resources, activities, and processes that you set up when you start a new program or want to revise an existing one. So using that same logic model as a roadmap idea, let's look on the left side of the screen, and we see where San Diego is on the left side in the green zone just above the US-Mexico border. And imagine that you have a new job that is starting in Tampico. And if you look over in the right bottom side of the screen, you will see where Tampico is in the orange zone. So, are you going to just set out from San Diego in your car, knowing that you've got to get to work in Tampico in a week's time and be ready to start? Are you just going to start driving on any road you encounter? I think the answer is probably no. You're going to use directions that someone gives you. Maybe you've already made that drive before. Maybe you'll use your GPS. Maybe somebody's going with you that can help you navigate. But the main thing is that when you get to San Antonio, you want to know, okay, what are the roads that I'm going to need to make those final turns to get to Tampico? That's what a logic model does. It provides you with a roadmap. Now, the purpose of a logic model has three basic things that it does that has a result. It helps us to think, to plan, and to communicate our program objectives and our actual accomplishments. So the next question we ask is, when do we want to use a logic model? And I would advise that when we want to do it when we want to communicate with people inside and outside our organization, because they each have unique reasons why they need to understand what it is we're doing. So the things that you want to communicate to them are what you're doing, what you're going to do, why you expect what you're doing, why you expect it to work, the activities that need to happen and when they will happen, and then how your desired outcomes are achieved. Here are some ways that our members can look at where they can use a logic model. So we talked about internally. So in strategic planning, you can help to build a shared understanding of what your program is all about and how the parts work together. Program planning, you can find the gaps in your theory or your logic of the program you are planning to do and work to resolve them before you find yourself in a crisis point. And the third internal place you can use a logic model is with resource allocation. The logic model will help you focus your attention and resources on your priorities, on your operations, and the key results that you've set forth as being more important than other things you do. Now, externally, we've got three audiences that we are communicating with through a logic model. First of all, funders. You want to get their attention, their respect, and their funds. And one reason why funders like to see a logic model is because they frequently see applications that lack solid descriptions of how programs will demonstrate their effectiveness. So a logic model can give the foundation the information they need to evaluate your project in a way that's to your benefit. The second stakeholder group externally are your clients. Imagine that you are a social service organization and you have a family that is deciding between several different organizations to use these services that they desperately need. If you use a logic model, you can learn how to communicate with those stakeholders in language that is clear and understandable by them so that they can evaluate which program best suits their needs. And the final group that we need to communicate with is our community. This is going to form part of your evaluation plan, your general communications plan, like public relations, and your marketing plan, how you attract people to what you do. And I will also venture one more thing. If you involve and engage your stakeholders in designing your programs and your evaluation, you are going to get them to be closer to you and support you financially, in terms of their volunteer time, and as well as serving as ambassadors for your organization. Next, let's talk about the why. So there's three really simple reasons why I believe that you should use a logic model. First is you want to understand a problem or a situation better. You want to define what you want to do about it. And you want to describe things you need to implement your plan. We can take that one step further, and using a logic model can help you explain the results you expect. You can outline how you will evaluate them. You have a way of depicting the resulting changes to your world as a result of what you've done, and you can communicate to others that your approach is worth investing in. All right, let's move on to actually creating a logic model. So we mentioned our colleagues at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Yes, this is the very same foundation that over 100 years ago founded Kellogg cereals and has moved on to have influence not only in our eating habits, but in terms of providing nourishment, but also nourishing the way that they use their products provided the first seed funding for the foundation. The foundation's gone on to be a much broader entity than just the products that it started with, and it is a worldwide influencer of best practices in philanthropy. So we are grateful to them for providing everything that I'm talking about today. Comes from their free resources, which we will share later. Okay, let's move on to section 3, understanding logic models. And if you will just bear with me for a moment while I move to the next section of my notes. Okay. All right, so here's what the Kellogg Foundation said about why they wanted to help us. And I think this says it's very clear. We as nonprofits are being pressed to demonstrate the effectiveness of our program activities. And we are equally being pressured to show the outcomes in our evaluation of the work that we do. There are 3 different types of logic models, and I don't want to get too hung up on the theory about these, but it is helpful, I think, just to understand when people are looking at them, basically what they mean. So the first one is the theory approach, and it's one that links together theoretical ideas. And it explores and explains resources and reasons behind a program. Given the practical bent of almost all of our members, I don't know that the theory approach is one that they are going to choose when they create a logic model. The second one is the outcomes approach. And what that does is that it shows your resources, it shows your activities, and it shows your results, and it displays the relationships between all of those things. The final one is the activities approach. It pays most attention to connecting the resources and activities and results in a really great detail. Now, we'll just say that what we'll talk about today is a practical combination of the activities and the outcomes approaches. But anyone who wants to go into the Kellogg Foundation Logic Model Guide can find more detailed explanations of each 3, and make their own decisions about what's important to them. Okay, so now we are going to look at our first visual of a logic model. And as you can see, it is a visual depiction of a process. It uses a series of boxes with arrows that connect the boxes, a series of numbers that talk about the stages of a process, and it divides them into two areas. First is your planned work. We're looking on the left side of the screen. Planned work takes into account the resources or what you put into the program when you're planning it. The second aspect of planned work are the activities you're going to do. Then, if you look on the right side of the screen, you see your intended results. Those are the outputs, the outcomes, and your impact. And remember, I told you we're going to define all these terms, and we will do that in the next few slides. But first, I want to talk about some background work that everyone needs to do before they start filling out their own logic model. The first is their current situation. What is it that you are trying to change? The second is, what's your theory of change? Now, a logic model can be referred to as a theory of change. It can also be called a program theory. So if you see any of these three terms, logic model, program theory, or theory of change, don't worry about them. They're all saying the same thing. What you are planning to do to change the situation for the better. Now, your assumptions are things that you believe will happen, and your external factors are things that are beyond your control that will influence your chances of success. Next, you want to think about your existing and planned programs or projects. What are you doing now? Are you going to continue doing that, or are you trying to do something else? And then the final one is your budget. What's it going to cost to pay for your activities, and then to evaluate and communicate their success? Once you've done that and then looked at those three logic model types, decide which one will make it easiest for you and your stakeholders to understand what you will do and what you hope to achieve. Excuse me for that bell that just went off. It was reminding me to advance to the next slide. All right, so let's talk about our basic components. And as you can see, the logic model is has a little bit more information that helps us understand it. So if we let's start with our basic components. All right, so if we look at our inputs and resources, you see that they are defined as certain resources that are needed to operate your program. And again, I'm looking on the left side of the screen. And these inputs or resources might be your funding, other existing organization, potential collaborating partners, existing organizational and interpersonal networks, staff and volunteers, time available to complete the project, facilities, equipment, and supplies that you will need. All right, you see how that is now set forth just in the specific slide about inputs and resources. And now we are now moving one step over to our activities. And it's defined by the Kellogg Foundation using that if-then proposition we started out with. If you have access to them, to those resources, then you can use them to accomplish your program goals. Some things that might be included in that are processes, techniques, tools, events, technology, actions, and think about them in three different areas. Think about them as products, as services, or as infrastructures. Now we're coming to two areas in the intended results that can sometimes be confusing. So let's address this head on. We're going to talk about outputs and outcomes. The first we'll talk about are the outputs. And they are the direct results of your program activities. They are size and scope of your services. And the if-then proposition is that if you do your activities, then you will deliver this amount of product or services. Think about that because that's a key term there, the amount of products or services. We'll talk about those when we fill out our template. All right, so now bear with me, outcomes. So outcomes are things that are broader. They're changes in attitudes, behaviors, knowledge, skills, in status or level of functioning. So they're not amounts, they are broader changes in the problem that you are facing, in the people who need your services. And the if-then proposition basically says, if you have accomplished your plan activities, gotten those outputs, then your participants benefit in certain ways. One more thing to remember is that foundations and other funders are going to want us to talk about our short-term outcomes, our long-term outcomes, and somewhere in between, our medium-term outcomes. Now, we all talk about having impact. And in terms of impact in a logic model, it comes down to three things: improve conditions, increase capacity, and changes in public policy. The if-then proposition says, if all of the previous parts have been achieved, done as planned, certain changes will happen to organizations, communities, and systems. One more thing that we need to talk about, because we want to be accountable to our clients, to our boards of directors, to our funders, and most importantly, to ourselves. We need to know how to evaluate our programs so that we can describe the results, evaluate what the data tells us, and demonstrate how they show our progress toward the change we're seeking to make. Some new vocabulary that I encourage people to delve into in the Kellogg Program Guide talks about evaluation, questions, and indicators of success. Look at the areas that talk about our focus area, our key audience for each focus area, the questions we ask in each focus area and its audience, the information we are going to need asked in that question, and the indicators of what information that could be collected that indicates the status of our program. Okay, so those areas are focus area, audience, questions, information use, indicators, and then finally an important one, technical assistance. What technical assistance might we need when we are submitting a proposal that tells us that we need to acquire as part of our planning process? All right, so I promised that section 4 would be about creating a logic model. So first we are going to look at some examples of different people's logic models, because what's important to remember is that a logic model needs to work for you. There's no one right way to do it. So here is, oh, I just like this slide. It's crossing the border at Nuevo Laredo. And, but these railroad cars remind me of what happens in a logic model. They are moving in sequence. They have a goal of where they are going. All right, here's a basic logic model template. This could be done in a table. in a Word program, or it can be done in a spreadsheet. But basically, it takes those squares that we saw in the earlier template, arranges them from left to right. As you can see, it goes inputs to activities to outcomes. And it also asks some other things that we mentioned before. At the bottom, you can see it provides a place for you to list your assumptions. On the right bottom, it lists the external factors that are facing that influence the situation. But you can see what's also important is at the top, they've placed what the program is for. So this particular one is a health information outreach program. And then it shows its goal, the impact it seeks to have. Improve community members' abilities to find, evaluate, and use health information. Two things easily understood by all of your stakeholders. Okay, this is from an arts organization in New York City called Fractured Atlas. And I think, as you can see here, they've actually taken a more artistic approach to it, using color and shape and design to show to their audiences the same three things. You can see on the bottom, there's a legend that says their activities. Arranged above them are the activities they will show. Then you see 3 red arrows leading to a series of blue outcomes. And what I find fascinating about this one is that there are multiple arrows linking multiple outcomes that mean something to the internal and external stakeholders of this organization. But as you can see in the green box on the right side, the green arrows, the green legend called impact, their big goal is to have a more agile and resilient cultural ecosystem. I like this smoking reduction program one because it actually works from the bottom to the top, not from side to side. You know, right from the outset, it's a smoking reduction program because that's at the very top. You also see the final outcome is reduced illness and death. So, very clearly stated what the impact of the program is. And the reader can choose to read it from the bottom, from the inputs. What is the things that the organization needs? Well, if you see the third one, sufficient funding in that purple box is one of them. And then you go up through the activities, the outputs, the outcomes, the final outcomes, and you can see that people can see in both directions, depending on where they are going to fall into the process, they see the whole continuum of things that lead to finally reducing illness and death through smoking cessation. The final model we're going to show is confusing to me at first glance. It comes from the Center for Disease Control of the US federal government, and it is the city of Racine, Wisconsin presented this about preventing prenatal lead poisoning. So you can see that this is a complicated enough one that in the bottom left-hand corner, they've actually had to give you a legend that shows how things are color-coded. It's color-coded. I will point out to this, the purple boxes that look like cartoon thought bubbles, is that they have arrows and they explain their indicators of program effectiveness. I would suggest that people study this to see if a complicated approach like this is essential to what they're doing. And if it's not, choose one of the less complicated ones. All right, let's move on now into filling out our own logic model template. All right, so I have combined, as you can see, and created a template that includes all the things that we've been talking about so far. At the top, it includes the name of the program or project, the situation the organization finds itself in, the impact at which it wishes to have, the assumptions it is making, and the external factors they believe will influence their success. Then we move into that series of railroad cars, inputs and resources, moving into outputs that are demonstrated by the activities and their participants, and then finally the outcomes, short-term, medium, and long-term. Below that would come a description of how they will evaluate their progress, and then finally the budget that they will use to fund all of this. I would encourage everyone at the outset to engage their stakeholders. I mentioned earlier that it is a good way to deepen relationships with those people, and the way it does that is that it helps to clarify their expectations of your programs. And so some people that I advocate you talking to, first is your program staff, your clients and service recipients, your other partners, your funders, your board members, community representatives, and volunteers. All right, so I am now using an example from the Kellogg Foundation Logic Model Guide that is called the My Town Community Free Clinic Project. And so that is going to go into our logic model template. Imagine that you have a sheet of paper in front of you with all those categories, and we're going to fill it out now. First goes the title of the program. Second goes the situation. And this is about the issues or the problems to be solved. And as we can see, the people in My Town USA have noticed that there are more and more of their uninsured residents having to turn to their local hospital's emergency room for care. They also know that that care is expensive and it's not the best way to offer care that leads to long-term healthier people. So they're working to create a free clinic. Now, as I said in the template, we want to look at our long-term impact. So for this organization, they have defined certain long-term impacts of their free clinic. And I'll draw your attention to just a couple of these. At the bottom, they want to serve 900 patients a year. They want 90% of their patients to be satisfied over 5 years. They have a fundraising goal of establishing an endowment to provide funding for the clinic, and they also have a volunteer goal. They want to have 300 volunteers serving regularly. So that's the broader impact. In addition to reducing the number of uninsured ER visits, as well as patients beginning to provide some of the clinic operating expenses. The assumptions that they are making as they move into this is they're assuming that the number of people without health insurance will increase. And they are assuming that because of that, the number of emergency room visits will also increase. They come to these assumptions because of two external factors beyond their control. And those are the cost of their health insurance is going to continue to rise, and that there will be decreased federal and state subsidies. All right, I'm going to advocate, as we look at this sample logic model template, that we plan from the end backwards. Plan from the end backwards. As you can see in this red oval, you see that we have circled impact. It's what they want to achieve in My Town USA. And they know, okay, if we want to have this impact, this big change in our community and in our community's lives, we need to then have these outcomes. We need to have change in patients' attitudes about their need for a medical home. We need to change how frequently they come in and the number that come in for their annual physicals. We need to have ER and individual physicians refer people to the clinic, and we need to decrease the volume of unreimbursed emergency room visits. All right, so how are we going to know that those outcomes are being achieved? Well, we move again back to our outputs. And these are things that we can count. We can count the number of patients referred. We can count the number of patients who enroll in our program, the number of visits in any given year, our number of volunteers. We can evaluate marketing by the number of flyers that are distributed, and we can evaluate our community's knowledge by the number of phone calls coming in seeking information. All right, so how are we going to achieve those outputs? Well, we need to undertake certain activities. And these are the basic things that are going to happen with our organization that we need to put into place. We need to hire an executive director. We need to visit sites of other free clinics near us. We need to have a planning retreat amongst our volunteers and our staff and our board. A funding strategy needs to be created. We need a plan for finding volunteers to help us. We need to secure a facility where our patients can go to and gather that is convenient and inexpensive for them to come to. And we need to devise an evaluation plan that we all buy into. All right, and then finally, what happens before those activities? Those inputs and resources. Are we an IRS 501c3 that can get charitable contributions? We need a board of directors. We need endorsements from perhaps our local hospital, insurance companies, our ambulance companies. Perhaps we'd like to get a donated facility so that we don't have to spend money to rent a facility. We need job descriptions for everyone who's going to work and volunteer. Want to set aside our first year's funding so we are not scrambling for money once the doors are open. We need input, we need equipment, we need a process for orienting our staff and our volunteers, and we need a budget. As you can see, as this big red oval indicates, we have got inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and an impact that means something to everybody who will be involved with our organization during every step of the way, providing our residents with inexpensive health care. Now let's talk about evaluation, and I encourage you to download the Kellogg Foundation evaluation guide, also available in English and Spanish. And what it does is it will guide you how to analyze in terms of three things: your context, which is relationships and capacity; your implementation, which is quality and quantity; and your outcomes, which are effectiveness, magnitude, and satisfaction. Look at the Kellogg Foundation evaluation guide. Our budget is one of the last two things we feel. Kellogg Foundation says that this organization is going to need $150,000 in year one. And here are some possible things that they're going to need money for: salaries, equipment, utilities, information technology, insurance, and supplies. What is missing here? What's missing is money for evaluation. And foundations find that including a plan and funding for evaluation is frequently missing from grant proposals. And when people are reviewing your proposal, it begs the question, how do I know that you will achieve what you say you will? All right, let's go back over now that we have a filled in logic model. And as I said, imagine that this is all on one sheet, but for the sake of seeing it clearly on our screen, it's divided up into three parts. We have the program, the name of the program, the situation, the impact, assumptions, and external factors. The central section of your logic model is that graphic depiction of inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. The next section is our evaluation program. As you can see, it's divided here also into a combination with our budget. And as you noted, no evaluation for money here. Don't make that mistake. Include it in your budget. That's the logic model. Now let's talk about how you can use it to achieve greater success. We talked earlier about the two areas where you can use it. You can use it internally for strategic planning, for program planning, and for resource allocation. Externally, you can use it with your funders, your clients, and your community. All right, let's wrap up. We started out with setting up our learning objectives. So today we have learned how to complete a sample planning template, understand the basic components of a logic model, explain the advantages of using one to our stakeholders, and in a second we're going to talk about gaining resources for obtaining further information. So, I have mentioned numerous times the Kellogg Foundation Logic Model Guide. Here are the links where you can find both the English and Spanish version. I would also like to suggest that you visit the Foundation Center. You can go to your local libraries to get access to the Foundation Center's resources, or you can go to the website. Much of my background information has come from an organization that I am a member of, the Grant Professionals Association. They too have a lot of free information you can get at their website. And then finally, the University of Wisconsin Extension Center has its own training program in using logic models in other areas of nonprofit management. And I encourage you to include them as well when you are delving further into logic models. Salid, I would be happy to take any questions and answers that people may have now.
Thank you so much, George. This session has, like all of your sessions, are very informative and very easy to understand. You take out the mystery and the stress out of something that seems very complicated. We want to be respectful of everybody's time, so we will only be able to answer 2 questions. The first question is if you could explain once again the difference between outputs and outcomes, please.
That's a great question, and I'm glad that we can revisit it. So the outcomes are things that you can count. Things that you can count. More people attending your programs, more people who are enrolled in your programs, more programs themselves, things that you can count. Outcomes are broader changes, changes in behavior, changes in attitude, and changes in condition. Let me use an example. So imagine that you are working in clean water in a river that runs through your area. So some outputs might be that there are fewer pollutants in the river water, which scientists can test before and after to say there are fewer parts per million of this carcinogenic substance. Now, what is an outcome of that? An outcome would be people are now utilizing the river for recreation. We are able to irrigate more areas of land because the water is clean, and we can drink the water out of the river because we've gotten all the pollutants out of it. Outcomes are numbers, outputs are numbers, outcomes are changes in behavior.
Thank you. So the second and final question is, why do you recommend preparing a logic model starting with the impact instead of the inputs?
Yes. So I want to, let's go back and use the map from San Diego to Tampico. So you could start out from San Diego and you could start driving. And you might eventually find your way to Tampico, but you might make a few wrong turns along the way. Maybe you get to Yuma and you decide to go north or south, but maybe that makes your distance take a day longer or 2 days longer because you have to backtrack. And or as I mentioned earlier, you get to San Antonio and you don't know which of your many options which freeway option you're gonna take. And so then you finally get to Tampico. I suggest and advocate using this map analogy. If you start at Tampico and you then compare beginning and end, you can see where you're starting and where you need to end up. And I think that when we are program planning, understanding what it is we want to achieve helps us understand all the pieces, all the segments of your map that need to be in place to get to that big goal.
Well, thank you again, George, for your presentation. We look forward to future collaborations. We would also like to thank Con Alma Health Foundation for making this webinar possible. And finally, I'd like to remind everybody that you can maintain engaged with the BPP or with George Nunes by going to our website, www.borderpartnership.org, or you can send us an email at info@borderpartnership.org, and you will receive an email of this recording, and you can find the slides and the recording posted on our website within the next couple of days. Thank you. George, would you like to add anything before we say our goodbyes?
I'd just like to add that just like you don't fear getting into your car when you drive on a trip because you know how to drive a car, don't be afraid of a logic model.
Wonderful analogy, George. So once again, thank you, George, and thank you everybody for participating on this webinar, and that concludes it for today's session.